and in this video we're going to take a look at events which transpired on the day of the murders. Also in this video I'm going to be taking a look at a new potential suspect and their possible connection with the Rettendon murders.
It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Michael Steele was then asked about his whereabouts on the day of the murders. He was asked about the call from the Sorrel Horse public house, the call at 14:29 from that phone box to Tony Tucker's mobile. He said it was not him making that call. Then, 3 minutes later at 14:32, another call to the mobile phone of Tony Tucker. The next call with the same timing of 14:32, from that phone box to another phone box at Timberlog Lane in Clayhill Road, Basildon, connected with Pat Tate. It was put to Michael Steele that those calls were first to Tony Tucker and then to Pat Tate. He said the phone calls from the Sorrel Horse were not made by him. He gave the same answer to the call at 14:52, 20 minutes later, which is a call to Darren Nichols' mobile. That is a call from the payphone to Nichols' mobile 288. Again, Mr. Steele said these calls were not made by him. He said, quote, "I think Nichols was at the Sorrel Horse. I know full well Nichols had sought to phone me. I'm suggesting it is possible that Nichols may have been there at the phone box." Michael Steele was also asked to look at phone calls on page 73. He accepted that at 18:03 and 18:09 he made 2 calls to Wome's mobile. He was asked about the phone call to Tate's mobile at 18:44 and said, quote, "I was never in the Range Rover. I was never in the Range Rover with Tate, Rolfe and Tucker. Womes and I did not shoot them dead." End quote. Okay, so let's just interject here. Now this does form quite an integral part of the prosecution's case, and albeit this is what you would class as circumstantial evidence, a lot of people who look into this case do feel that this information, this evidence is actually quite damning. Now as you can see on this photograph, this aerial photograph in front of you here, Jack Wome's workplace was incredibly close to the Sorrel Horse pub, and many people think that this was really the first slip-up that Michael Steele and Jack Womes made. Up until this point in time, it would appear that Michael Steele and Jack Womes had been fairly careful with their phone usage. They hadn't used their mobile phones, there's no communication between these 2 individuals on their mobiles to any of the 3 deceased. All communication seems to have taken place via payphones. Now, if you are a believer in the fact that Michael Steele and Jack Womes are in fact guilty of these triple murders, then as I say, this is really the first oversight which has taken place. And what I want you to ask yourselves at home is that if you went to the trouble of not using your mobile, you went to the trouble of using a payphone to contact these individuals to arrange the meeting for later that night, then why would you use a payphone right outside your workplace? One way that I could explain the usage of the phone box at the Sorrel Horse Inn, which was very close to G&T Commercials, Jack Womes' then workplace, is that Jack Womes didn't really have any kind of direct connection outside of prison concerning these 3 individuals, at least not known to those around Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. People who knew Tucker, Tate and Rolfe may well have known of Michael Steele, but probably not Jack Womes. So did they think it was actually fairly safe to use a phone box close to Jack Womes' workplace? Now, if we turn this on its head for one moment and we look at this from an alternative perspective, let's assume that Michael Steele and Jack Womes are in fact innocent of the triple murders. then what better place to place a phone call than very close to the workplace of Jack Womes? If you didn't have access to, say, Steele or Womes' own mobile phone and you couldn't place a call to one of those three individuals, as in Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, and create that linkage there, I guess, in terms of a phone record, then what better place to actually place a call but from a phone box very close to G&T commercials? What is also quite telling and quite intriguing about these calls is that there's a 20-minute gap and then there's a phone call placed to Darren Nichols. Now, when we get on to the question of Darren Nichols and his own phone usage, I mean, this is a story in itself, to be perfectly honest. We have Darren Nichols, who claims on the 6th of December that Michael Steele is eager to get hold of him. He's returning Michael Steele's calls. It's Michael Steele who is initiating the contact on the day of December the 6th. But this simply is not reflected in the phone records in any way, shape or form. It's Darren Nichols who is desperate to get hold of Michael Steele. It's Darren Nichols who is constantly trying to call Michael Steele on December the 6th. Another point which must be discussed are the two telephone calls at 18:03 and 18:09. Both of these calls are from Michael Steele's mobile to the mobile phone of Jack Womes. Now, during this time period, according to Darren Nichols, he is in the company of Jack Womes. Yet in his official statement, there is not any mention at all of these two telephone calls taking place. There's a lot of detail in Darren Nichols' police statement, his official statement. There's a lot of, as I say, intricate details about the weather outside. It was very cold. I had to put the heater on in the vehicle to demist the windows. I got out of the car, got my boots wet. We couldn't stick on the false number plates because they were wet and we didn't have anything to wipe them with. Loads and loads of these intricate little details flooded in Darren Nichols' official statement. Yet when we come to actually two telephone calls that did occur, 18:03 and 18:09, this is the kind of information that Darren Nichols could have given in his official statement, which would have corroborated exactly what he was saying. If he'd have said, okay, I was in the car, there was a couple of phone calls, Michael Steele rung us on a few occasions to check where we were, to check how close we were to Workhouse Lane, or check anything basically. If he'd have even mentioned these two telephone calls taking place, that is something that we could verify to say, actually, Darren Nichols was in the company of Jack Womes at this time period. He witnesses these calls. How did he know that these calls took place? Well, obviously, because he was there. Now we move on to a point which is actually going to be completely new for the vast majority of followers to this channel, followers to the Essex Boys case. There is a man by the name of Colin Bridge, a friend of Darren Nichols. Now, in the summing up in court, the judge's summing up in court, it is mentioned the following. Bearing in mind they're talking about the day of the murders here, the 6th of December 1995, and Jack Womes recalls Colin Bridge turning up at G&T commercials. He said Colin Bridge came to his yard at Barham that day when he was loading the tractor on. It was about 2 o'clock, 2:20 or 2:30. Colin was in an escort van and wanted to borrow Womes' transport trailer to pick up the vehicle which Womes himself eventually picked up, the Volkswagen Passat. Jack Womes said he knew Colin Bridge because he had seen him at Meadow Cottage and he had come into the yard with Darren Nichols once before. You will remember Colin Bridge's evidence, members of the jury, and that was that he had never been to the yard before. That is another dispute between witnesses which you have to resolve. Jack Womes states, Colin explained Darren had got a vehicle broken down and wanted to borrow my trailer to pick it up. I told him he couldn't borrow my trailer. I wouldn't lend it to him. I had the tractor on it anyway. Also, his escort van wouldn't be able to pull it. Now, just to give you a little bit of brief background on this Colin Bridge character. Basically, Colin Bridge was the guy who was actually driving the vehicle when Darren Nichols was pulled over, when he was initially arrested. When Darren Nichols had this cannabis resin in the back of his vehicle, the person who was driving was none other than Colin Bridge. Now, interestingly, in the defence's trial points, which is basically a document with different paragraphs discussing how they're going to attack the evidence of Darren Nichols, it's mentioned here the following. It is the appearance of Colin Bridge, Nichols' suicide jockey, who turns up at Jack Wome's commercial premises driving a white Ford Escort van on the 6th of December, which magnifies the importance of witness Kevin Tarbuck. So clearly here we have two different versions of events. We've got Jack Womes, who claims that Colin Bridge turns up to his workplace, G&T Commercials, which happens to be right next to the Sorrel Horse pub, right next to that payphone where the phone calls to Tucker, Tate and Rolfe are made. On the day of the murders, we have him driving supposedly a white Ford Escort van, and we have Colin Bridge completely denying this, saying that I've never been to this yard in my life, got no idea what he's talking about. But we will get to the statement of Kevin Tarbuck in a little while. But what I find quite intriguing about this is the fact that we're looking here for a white Ford Escort van. You'll understand why this becomes important in a little while. But before we get into the statement of Kevin Tarbuck, let's just play devil's advocate here for one moment. Let's just say that Jack Womes, what he is claiming here is actually the truth. Colin Bridge turns up with a white Ford Escort van. What would be the purpose of that? If it's some connection to Darren Nichols and these murders, what benefit could that possibly serve? Well, if Michael Steele is actually correct here, and it's Darren Nichols who's making the phone calls from the Sorrel Horse Inn, could Colin Bridge have been used for some kind of distraction, or just to check that Jack Womes was actually working that day? He was at G&T Commercials, he's where he's supposed to be, and during that time, whilst Colin Bridge is visiting, Darren Nichols is making those telephone calls from the Sorrel Horse pub. Now, as I say, this is just pure speculation, but it does make me wonder if there is some truth here to what Jack Womes is claiming. What we're going to do now is take a look at the judge's summing up in court, where he mentions this statement from Kevin Tarbuck. After we've read this part of the summing up, I will then bring up Kevin Tarbuck's official police statement and we will go through it in its entirety. But the judge states the following. Kevin Tarbuck was seen by police officers on the 14th of December in connection with the murders 8 days before. He was working at Hanningfield near the reservoir. When he had finished work, he had come out and turned right onto the A130 and right towards Rettendon on the A127. Before that night, he travelled that road every evening except for weekends, and on the 6th of December he was driving a Ford Sierra. He left his work at approximately 7:50, not earlier than 7:45 or later than 8 p.m. Approaching Rettendon, he neared White House Farm, which he is familiar with. He was not aware of any turning just past White House Farm, but it became familiar on that occasion. This lane was located on the left-hand side as he was heading towards the turnpike. There were no cars in front or behind him on the road. It was very dark and he had his lights on at full beam. A white Ford Escort van pulled out in front of him and caused him to brake. He pulled out and turned left towards Rettendon in front of him. He did not see if it stopped. He just remembered seeing it pull straight out in front of him. He braked quite sharply and flashed his lights, as well as making what he called an obscene gesture. He got about 30 yards from the car in front and was not right behind it. He could not make out the occupant or occupants, they were only silhouettes. He could not say who was inside, but obviously one person was driving. The driver was accelerating. He got as far as the turnpike and the car in front had disappeared. Mr. Tarbuck states, "My previous occupation was a tyre and exhaust fitter. I am in no doubt it was a white Escort van. I'd say the approximate time was 5 to 8. It was in my sight for about 30 seconds. I was interviewed the very next day on the 7th of December and arrangements were made for me to make a statement." Cross-examined by Mr. Lederman, he said his work did not have set hours. He made his statement about a week later, the following Thursday. He agreed his statement started with the words, "At about 7:40 I finished work," end quote. He said it was later than 7:40 p.m. he started his journey. When he spoke, according to the police, they said someone will come round, and someone did come round about a week later. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, he said, quote, "As far as I know, it happened at around 7:50 p.m. I was working at the West Hanningfield Reservoir. It was about a quarter of a mile to the main road. So far as I could see, it was just the driver in the car. I could only see somebody on the driver's side. There may have been someone else in the car, but I didn't see anybody. He looked at photograph 2 and accepted there was a track parallel with the road coming from Workhouse Lane, as well as Workhouse Lane itself. He was not aware of that track until now. He did not see the vehicle in the track or on the lane. All he saw was a van moving in front of him. Re-examined, he said there were 2 separate windows in the back of the van. He was asked by the CID later, who asked me what happened and asked me if I saw a white Passat. It was definitely not a white Passat. The time was just before 8 p.m. Right, so what is being described here by Kevin Tarbuck is a vehicle pulling out in front of him, causing him to brake sharply. He's obviously given him the V's, he's stuck his fingers up at him, probably beeped his horn and, called him a wanker out of his window, all that sort of stuff, just the usual. And this vehicle has basically sped off towards the turnpike. By the time he's got to the turnpike or down the other side of the hill, the escort van is nowhere to be seen. Now, I think what's most important to take from this statement is the fact that this guy, Kevin Tarbuck, uses this road on a daily basis. This is someone who's very familiar with this road. He travels to and from work every day of the week apart from weekends. Also important to remember is that this guy, Kevin Tarbuck, used to be an exhaust fitter and tyre fitter. So this is clearly someone with a mechanical background, or he's worked with cars. He knows exactly what an escort van looks like, let's be honest. So he's fairly credible in terms of the vehicle he witnesses. Now, where this gets a little bit strange is the fact that we have Darren Nichols claiming that he pulls out in front of a vehicle. It's almost as if Darren Nichols is replaying the events but choosing to be in a different motor vehicle. That's why the CID have said to this guy, "Are you sure it wasn't a cream or white coloured VW Passat that you saw?" And he said, "Nope, I'm 100% sure it was an escort van." Now, this is a very small passage from the book Blogs 19 where Darren Nichols recalls the events which transpired immediately after the murders. He states the following: "Michael Steele told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then on, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto a main road without looking. But I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie." Now, what do we make of this? Because this is basically Darren Nichols recalling pretty much word for word what transpired according to Kevin Tarbuck. This guy has been, he's driving down the road from work on his way home. This vehicle pulls out in front of him. He has, beeped his horn or given him some obscene gestures. I'm trying to see how these two events are not connected. How can they not be connected? They're both pulling out of the same lane. They're coming out of the same lane, around the same sort of time period, give or take 60 minutes. And I'm just trying to work out in my mind here how this can be two separate events, but I'm actually really struggling with that. So let's now take a look at that police statement in its entirety provided by Kevin Tarbuck. The following police statement was given by Kevin Tarbuck on the 14th of December 1995. He states the following: "I'm the above described person and I reside at the address Overleaf. I work for Sutcliffe Industrial Services Limited, who at present have a contract at Hanningfield Water Treatment Works. When I finish work, I leave the site and turn right onto the A130 towards Southend. I've been working on that site for the past 5 weeks and have travelled along that road every evening during that period. At around 1940 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 1995, I finished work and started my journey home. As I approached Rettendon along the A130, I had just passed White House Farm on the left-hand side and was approaching a small lane again on the left-hand side. As I got nearer to the lane, a white Ford Escort van emerged from the lane and turned left towards Rettendon in front of me. I only saw that it had one male person in it who was driving. The reason I remember this is that in pulling out in front of me it caused me to brake, and because it was icy and snowing I thought what an idiot he was. The vehicle then accelerated away from me. I followed, but by the time I had reached the Rettendon Turnpike roundabout, the van was nowhere to be seen. I would think the van was a D or E registration due to the style of the vehicle. I would not be able to identify the driver again. I would estimate the time that this happened would be around 1950 hours. At the time of the incident it was dark and snowing, I had my windscreen wipers on and my headlights, but in spite of these conditions, visibility was fairly good. There was no other vehicle immediately in front of me nor behind me. If the van had waited for me to pass, he could have pulled out without affecting anybody. The vehicle was in my sight for about 15 seconds, and the nearest I was to it was about 30 yards.